Chris Sewall here, baseball card collector, investor, dealer, in that order. Welcome everyone. Today we're going to do a to grade or not to grade video, and we're going to look at two cards. These are both cards that I recently sent into PSA myself, and I took some notes on the cards before I sent them in as to what I thought they would grade and why I thought they would grade the way, why I thought they would get that grade. And so we're going to evaluate that and look and see how I got to my prediction, and then also do a financial breakdown ahead of time as to whether it's worth it financially to send these cards in for grading. And I'll of course show the results, what the card ended up grading at the end. The main purpose of this video is to just help people decide if they should get their cards graded. What's the process of deciding that? It's a question I get asked probably more than any other, is just, should I get this card graded? And people want to know, how do you end up predicting the grade, and how do you sort of determine financially if it makes sense? So we got two cards to look at here. A vintage card, a 1961 Topps Sandy Koufax, and a modern card, a 2014 Panini Prizm, Silver Prizm, Tom Brady. All right, we'll look at the Koufax first. And again, 1961 Topps Sandy Koufax appears to be a pretty solid card. No major condition issues like a crease or paper loss or writing or anything that's very, very significant. In fact, the card looks pretty nice at first glance, but you got to check each of the four subgrade categories: corners, edges, surface, and centering. We'll start with the centering. If you look left to right, it's a little bit off center, not significantly, but the right border is definitely wider than the left border. That'll have an impact. And top bottom centering as well. The top border is definitely wider than the bottom border. So while centering is not a major issue here, it'll definitely knock off points from the end grade. The back centering looks almost perfect. Back centering does need to be considered, although it's much less important than the front centering. If we next check out edges, looking over the entire card, all four edges on both the front and the back, the edges look great everywhere. I don't think the edges are going to play any sort of role in dropping the grade of the card here. Corners are an issue. They're all four corners are tipped. They're certainly not terrible, but they're certainly not perfectly sharp right angles either. A little bit of rounding to them. On the front, it's pretty minor, but it's definitely there, and it's actually a little more noticeable on the back, especially on the bottom two corners. Look at the bottom right corner. That's definitely, we'll call that a tipped corner or significantly tipped corner. That's definitely going to play. That's definitely going to drop the card's grade down a bit. And then we have to check surface, which is probably the most overlooked category by people sort of getting into the grading game, or new people entering the grading game, is not considering the surface. This card does have surface issues. It's not major, but on the front there's all sorts of little specks here and there, and this will definitely play a part. PSA is going to notice these, and it's going to knock the card's grade down. On the front, I've highlighted a few here, but there's actually more than just what I've highlighted. The lower right corner one with the little red dot, definitely an issue. The back doesn't really seem to have many, if at all. Very, very minor if there. But again, the front, the surface issues on the front are going to play a major role in what this card eventually grades. So adding all that up, and again, the card has no major issues, and it looks pretty strong eye appeal. Looks nice, but a bunch of sort of minor issues. A little bit off-centered left to right, a little bit off-centered top to bottom. Some tipped corners on the front, some tipped corners on the back, and a little bit of surface issues. Again, nothing that really detracts from the eye appeal, but enough minor issues that it's going to drop the grade down quite a bit. I thought this card was going to land in the 5 to 6 range, and I've mentioned it a number of times. I think it's important to make guesses based on a range, not like a single number, because if you guess a single number, you're just going to be wrong way too much. But if you sort of anticipate a range, like it might be this or this, then you'll land within your range a whole lot more and be less caught off guard with what the ultimate grade is. So my range for this card was a 5 to a 6. If I had to guess, I would guess a 5, but I thought a 6 was very much in play. I thought a 4 would have been way too harsh, so I didn't think that was realistic, although you never know when sending cards to PSA. And I thought a 7 was really not realistic at all. So 5 to 6, that was the range I came up with for this card. Okay, now that we have our predicted range, next thing to do is determine if it financially makes sense to send in this card for grading. And first thing you need to do is figure out what the card would sell for raw. And the best place to do this is eBay. Go on eBay and look at completed sales, sold listings that of the card raw that more or less lines up with your card condition-wise. Now, this can be tough often because you'll have to weed out a lot of outlier sales, both high and low. You'll have to really sort of dig down to find ones that match your condition or so. That can be tricky, but you can usually do it. And here's an example of 3 cards that I found in very similar condition that were sold raw, all in the $60 to $70 range or so. So I'm going to call this card raw about a $65 card. All right, next we need to determine what the card will sell for graded. And I generally use vintagecardprices.com for this, but you can use, there's any number of resources out there. You can just use eBay if you'd like. But vintagecardprices.com shows the average of recent sales of the card in each different grade. I've highlighted the PSA 5 and the 6 box as those were my predicted grades. And say look at the 5 box, you know, the green number at the top is the highest of recent sales, the red is the lowest of recent sales, and the white is the average of recent sales. The high and the low are often outliers, so really we're just looking at the white number there. $116 is what I would value this card at in a PSA 5, and $135 in a PSA 6. I'll often look at like the 4 and the 7 as well, just to sort of understand the upside and downside, but really the 5 and the 6 box are what we're looking at here. Okay, so now think in terms of the card raw is about $65. There's a $20 PSA fee. And then depending on what the card's grade, you can see what the added value by getting the card graded is at the bottom. And this is a no-brainer card to send in. If it gets the 5 or the 6 as predicted, it'll be plus $30 or plus $50. If it somehow miraculously pulls the 7, you're up big. And the downside is nothing. If it really surprisingly gets a 4, you're still basically breaking even. So this is an absolute no-brainer card to send in. And I should say, when you've been doing this a long time, such as I have, you don't have to go through this process. I mean, I know intuitively that a 61 Topps Sandy Koufax in mid-grade is going to be worth sending in every time. I don't have to go through this process to figure that out. But for newer people, like I mentioned, this is probably a good sort of exercise to walk through a few times to sort of understand it and get a hang of it. So the card came back from PSA and it graded a 5. And yeah, that was within the range, so nothing really surprising there. And because I sent this card in for grading, I will make $31 more than if I had sold it raw. It's a little bit overly simplified because it doesn't factor in seller fees, but approximately that. All right, next let's check out the Tom Brady. And again, this is a 2014 Panini Prizm Silver Prizm Tom Brady. And let's check out the 4 subgrade categories first. First, we'll check out the edges. Edges look very, very straight everywhere on the front and both on the back. Nothing going on with the edges. Corners also look very, very sharp on the front. They make perfectly sharp right angles on the front and on the back as well. The only note I made in my notes when I sent this card in is the back bottom right corner may have the slightest of slight tips, but I also made the note that I didn't think it was would impact anything. Next, let's check out the surface. And again, I think the surface is the most overlooked category from a lot of people when they're deciding whether to grade their cards. And with Prizm cards like this or Chrome cards like this, the surface is particularly sensitive and particularly important to look closely at and pay attention to, as they'll often have just really light scratches here and there or thumbprints, these sort of things. And yeah, PSA will knock the card's grade down if it has a scratch or a thumbprint, even if it's very, very minor. Now, I looked over this card very, very closely, and I did not see anything. I did not see any scratches, any thumbprints. I thought the front surface was absolutely perfect, and I thought the back surface was absolutely perfect as well, so I did not see any issue there. And the last category is centering, and this card's centering is interesting on this card because it has no border, right? So it's very tricky to determine the centering. Often when there's a card with no border, something about the card should be centered, like, for example, his name should be centered, or Patriots should be centered, or the Panini Prizm logo should be centered, but in this case, none of them on the front. Panini Prizm logo is clearly in the upper right. The name and team are clearly in the lower right. Nothing is supposed to be centered about this card, so there's nothing to determine centering. There's nothing to use to determine centering on the front of the card. You kind of have to just sort of guess that it's good, and that's basically what I did here. I guess in theory, you could find a PSA 10 copy of this card, a picture of it, and compare the centering that way. But I'll be honest, I didn't do that on this one. I just sort of went on faith that it's centered well. You can also do the same thing on the back often. Like, there's no border on the back, so it's not obvious if the card is centered or not. But you can usually find something that is supposed to be centered. In this case, the stats down at the bottom are clearly supposed to be centered on the card. So you can look at, just to the left of the stats and just to the right of the stats and sort of figure out if those, the space in there is the same on both sides. In this case, it was. So I figured that this card is centered. At least the back is clearly centered, and that sort of suggests on a modern card that the front is going to be centered as well. And I actually have no idea how the grading companies determine centering on a card like this, but perhaps they have some sort of sophisticated method, but my guess is they're sort of winging it in the same way that I am. But okay, add all that up, and I thought this card was a legit 10 contender. But if you've seen any of my PSA reveal videos recently, you know that, if I have 10 legit 10 contenders, I might only get 10s on like 2 of them. So more likely this card would get a 9, and I thought a 9 was sort of the best guess, and a 10 was definitely in play. I really didn't see how you could grade this less than a 9, but you do have to consider that, especially with modern cards. PSA has been a lot stricter lately, so I'm going to consider the 8 as well, but really my range here is 9 to 10. So what does the card sell for raw? Well, went on eBay and found a bunch of sales of raw copies in mint condition. Here were just 3, and you can see they're all sort of right around $60 or so, and so I value the card raw at about $60. Then look at the value of the card graded, and you can see 9s go for about $148 on average. The 10 column looked fishy because there's like a crazy sale of $2,500 there, so that might throw things out of whack. So that's one I want to check a little bit closer. If you click on it, you can see all the recent sales of a 10, and you can see $619 is way too high for the current market value of this card. It's clearly a card that's been coming way down in value in the last 6 months, and the most recent sale was $269. That was in February. There were actually 2 sales in February, the other one going for almost $500. So I would sort of value this card safely at about $300 in a PSA 10. So again, the card is about a $60 card raw. That is roughly a $20 PSA grading fee or so. And another one, this card is an absolute no-brainer to send in. If it gets the 9, which is my best guess, you're up $68. If it gets the 10, which is a very realistic possibility, up big, and really no downside. I mean, even if it flukishly gets an 8, basically a break even there. So absolutely no reason not to send this in. I mean, I guess I shouldn't say there's no downside. The card could be trimmed or altered or something like that. But for the most part, there's really no downside here and a lot of upside. So I sent this card in, and it got the 10. And I should say again, you know, I tend not to expect 10s on most of the cards I send in. When I have cards that I have in the 9 to 10 range, you know, only get a small percentage of 10s, and that's in my opinion because PSA has gotten a lot stricter with their grading in the last few years. Now there are going to be people who get much higher gem rate than me, but they're probably generally dealing in ultra modern. It's much easier to get 10s on ultra modern cards, let's say 2018 to present, than the cards that I generally send in. But you know, very happy to get the 10 on this particular card as it added over $200 in value for me. But that's it. Thank you everyone for watching, and please feel free to leave in the comments any questions you have at all about any part of this process. I'll certainly be happy to answer them, and hope you all found this helpful, and see you all again real soon. Thanks everyone.